Scott Higgs stood beneath a display of blue and white flowers at the front of a lakeside ballroom overlooking Lake Norman, North Carolina. Sunlight poured through tall windows, bouncing off crystal glasses arranged with perfect precision across nearly 24 tables. Soft music drifted through the room as almost 200 guests applauded, smiling at the couple they believed was beginning an exciting new chapter. A large banner hanging behind the stage read, "Celebrating our growing family." Scott took a slow breath and looked around the room. His company executives had come. Church friends filled several tables near the windows. Neighbors who had watched him raise his son waved proudly from the back. Relatives chatted over dessert plates. Co-workers laughed together while balancing wrapped gifts decorated in blue ribbons. Everything looked exactly the way he had hoped. After months of carefully managing conversations, delaying difficult decisions, and promising everyone that things would soon fall into place, this afternoon felt like the reward he had been waiting for. His eyes found Maris Vale. She stood only a few feet away wearing a light blue maternity dress, one hand resting gently on her growing belly. When she caught him looking at her, she smiled with complete confidence. In her mind, every delay had finally come to an end. Soon their daughter would arrive, and the future they had talked about so many times would finally become real. Scott smiled back. He truly believed the hardest part of his life was behind him. The event host adjusted the microphone before turning toward him. "Scott, I think everyone would love to hear a few words." Another round of applause swept through the ballroom. Scott walked onto the small stage with relaxed confidence. He thanked the host, adjusted the microphone, and looked across the room once more. "So many familiar faces," he said with a smile. "Thank you all for taking time out of your weekend to celebrate with us." Several guests nodded warmly. "This past year hasn't gone the way I expected." A few people exchanged knowing smiles. Life rarely followed anyone's plans. Scott continued, "But sometimes the future surprises you in ways you never imagined." More applause followed. He glanced toward Maris again. "I'm grateful for the family we're building together. I can't wait to meet our little girl, and I'm thankful every one of you chose to be part of this special day." The room filled with applause once again. Scott's shoulders relaxed. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Then the applause began fading, not all at once. One table stopped clapping. Then another. Conversations quietly disappeared. Heads slowly turned toward the ballroom entrance. Scott frowned. He hadn't finished speaking. Why was everyone suddenly looking away from the stage? Even Maris's smile began to disappear as she followed everyone else's gaze. Scott slowly turned around. The ballroom doors stood open. A woman wearing a simple navy dress had just stepped inside. She wasn't dressed for attention. There were no expensive diamonds around her neck, no dramatic entrance, no raised voice demanding answers. She simply stood there, holding a large cream-colored envelope against her side. The calm expression on her face made the silence inside the room feel even heavier. Beside her stood attorney Darian Cross, carrying a leather portfolio. A few steps behind them stood an older man whose face had turned pale before he even entered the room. Scott's father, Alton Higgs. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room became so quiet that the sound of the ballroom doors slowly closing echoed across the polished floor. Scott felt every bit of color leave his face. His fingers tightened around the microphone. For 16 years, the woman standing at the entrance had shared every important season of his life. She had celebrated promotions with him, comforted him after failures, worked beside him when money was scarce, raised their 13-year-old son with patience, consistency, and love. Together, they had built the kind of marriage other couples quietly admired, or at least everyone believed they had. Now she was standing inside a baby shower he had never told her existed. Maris looked from Scott to the unfamiliar woman standing across the room. Confusion slowly replaced the happiness that had filled her face only moments earlier. She leaned closer to Scott and whispered just loudly enough for him to hear. "Scott, who is she?" Scott opened his mouth. No words came out. For the first time in more than a year, every explanation he had rehearsed disappeared. Welcome to Will and Rise Stories. To every single person listening right now, thank you for being here. This channel is growing because of people like you who truly love emotional, unforgettable storytelling. Please support the channel by subscribing. The first person to unlock the front door every weekday was Tonia Stewart. By 6:30 each morning, her neighborhood in North Carolina was just beginning to wake up. Porch lights switched off one by one. A few neighbors walked their dogs. School buses had not yet started their routes. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still greeted each other by name and checked on elderly neighbors after heavy storms. Tonia appreciated that kind of community because she believed good lives were built through steady habits instead of grand promises. She stepped inside, carrying a folder filled with renovation plans. Before she could place it on the kitchen island, footsteps hurried down the stairs. "Morning, Mom." 13-year-old Jude adjusted his backpack before reaching for the cereal cabinet. "You're up early," Tonia said. "I've got a science quiz." "You studied every night this week." "I still get nervous." She smiled. "That means you're taking it seriously." Jude laughed. "I hope you're right." "You'll do fine." He nodded and began fixing his breakfast. A moment later, Scott Higgs walked into the kitchen wearing pressed work clothes with a travel mug already in his hand. "Morning." "Morning," Tonia answered. He kissed her forehead before opening the refrigerator. Without asking questions, he started cooking eggs while Tonia packed Jude's lunch. Neither needed instructions. After 16 years together, they knew each other's routines almost automatically. Scott placed breakfast on the table. Tonia handed Jude his lunch bag. Jude grabbed his backpack. "Don't forget the quiz," Scott reminded him. "I'm trying not to." Scott smiled. "You've already done the hard part." The three of them ate together before leaving for the day. Nothing about the morning seemed remarkable. That was exactly why people admired their family. There was no shouting, no constant arguments, no dramatic displays of affection. Only three people who appeared completely comfortable sharing the same life. After dropping Jude at school, Tonia drove across town to one of her restoration projects. An old Victorian house stood behind temporary fencing, surrounded by stacks of lumber and construction equipment. Most contractors would have demolished the building months earlier. Tonia refused. Her company, Stewart Restoration Group, had become one of the most respected restoration businesses in several North Carolina counties because she believed old homes deserved another chance. She walked through the front door wearing work boots instead of expensive shoes. Workers greeted her immediately. "Morning, Ms. Stewart." "Morning. How's the flooring coming?" "Almost finished." She walked through every room before checking the blueprints herself. If a wall needed measuring, she measured it. If supplies needed carrying, she helped carry them. Her employees respected her because she never expected anyone else to do work she wouldn't do herself. A familiar voice came from behind. "I figured you'd forget breakfast again." Tonia turned and smiled. Her uncle, Isaiah Stewart, walked inside carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know me too well. I've known you your whole life." He handed her 1 cup before looking around the house. "This place already looks different." "It still has a long way to go." Isaiah nodded. "Most people only notice what's damaged. I notice what's still worth saving." He smiled proudly. "You've been saying that since you were a teenager. It keeps proving true." Across town, Scott arrived at one of the largest commercial construction sites in the region. Tower cranes stretched high above unfinished buildings. Concrete trucks rolled through the entrance while hundreds of workers prepared for another busy day. Scott parked his truck and immediately began reviewing schedules with his supervisors. The project carried enormous responsibility. Finishing it successfully could earn him the biggest promotion of his career. His team respected him because he stayed organized and rarely lost his temper. He expected high standards from everyone, including himself. Back at school, Jude finished his science quiz before lunch. He smiled as he handed the paper to his teacher. That afternoon, he texted his mother. "Quiz went great." A few seconds later, Tonia replied, "I knew you could do it. Proud of you." That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table again. Jude talked excitedly about school. Tonia described the progress on the Victorian house. Scott shared updates from his construction project. Each person listened while the others spoke. After dinner, Jude spread several sketches across the dining table. "I designed another house." Scott leaned closer. Let's see it. Jude pointed proudly. This room faces the sunrise. I added solar panels. The hallways are wider, so older people can move around more easily. Tonia smiled. You thought about accessibility. I remembered what you always say. What do I always say? Buildings should make life easier for people. She laughed. I did say that. Scott looked at the drawing. You've got talent. Jude grinned. Maybe one day we'll build one together. Scott nodded without hesitation. I'd like that. Tonia watched both of them, smiling over the drawing. In moments like this, she believed they had built something stronger than bricks, concrete, or steel. She believed trust, family, and shared purpose could last a lifetime. She had no reason to believe otherwise. To everyone who knew them, the Higgs family looked like the kind of family every neighborhood hoped to have. And that was exactly why nobody noticed the first crack beginning to form. The commercial project entered its busiest phase only a few weeks later. Every morning, dozens of subcontractors arrived before sunrise. Engineers inspected progress, suppliers delivered materials, and supervisors checked schedules before crews spread across the massive site. Scott rarely had a free minute. One Tuesday morning, Calvin Brooks walked into the site office carrying a clipboard. You've got a design meeting at 10. Scott looked up. Who's coming? The consulting architects from Charlotte. Scott nodded. I'll be there. 10 o'clock arrived quickly. Several engineers gathered around a large conference table covered with blueprints. A woman Scott had never met stood near the front of the room. She extended her hand. I'm Maris Vale. Scott shook it. Scott Higgs. I've heard you're managing this entire project. We've all got a job to do. The meeting began immediately. They reviewed structural drawings, delivery schedules, material shortages, budget adjustments, safety requirements. Every discussion stayed focused on work. When the meeting ended, Maris smiled politely. It was nice meeting you. You too. Scott returned to the construction site without giving the meeting another thought. Over the following weeks, however, the project demanded constant coordination. Maris reviewed design revisions. Scott approved field adjustments. Emails became phone calls. Phone calls became planning meetings. Planning meetings often continued through lunch because neither of them had time to leave the site. Most conversations remained professional. Occasionally, they discussed ordinary things. Favorite restaurants, the towns where they grew up, the long hours construction demanded. Neither considered those conversations unusual. Meanwhile, Tonia's days followed the same dependable rhythm. She continued restoring historic homes across North Carolina. One afternoon, she climbed a ladder herself to inspect damaged roof beams while members of her crew waited below. One worker called up to her. You could have asked one of us. Tonia smiled. I wanted to see it myself. She finished the inspection before climbing down. The beam stays. It doesn't need replacing? No. She tapped the old wood. The outside looks rough, but the center is still solid. The crew nodded. Nobody questioned her judgment. Years of working beside her had earned their trust. Later that afternoon, Isaiah Stewart visited the project again. He walked slowly through the restored rooms before smiling. You've brought another house back to life. Tonia looked around proudly. It still has work left. It always will. She laughed. I guess every house teaches patience. Isaiah nodded. So do families. The words stayed with her, though she had no reason to think deeply about them. That Friday evening, the Stewart family followed another tradition. Family night. No business meetings, no extra work, no excuses. Scott arrived home on time. Together they drove to Jude's middle school football game. Jude wasn't playing football. He proudly performed with the school band. Every time the band marched onto the field, Tonia and Scott stood and applauded. During halftime, Denise Holloway walked over carrying hot chocolate. I don't know how you two stay this organized. Tonia laughed. We live by one calendar. Scott smiled. If it isn't on the calendar, it probably isn't happening. Everyone laughed. It sounded simple, but it had worked for years. Birthdays, school events, doctor appointments, church activities, business meetings. Everything went onto the same family calendar hanging inside the kitchen. Protecting family time mattered just as much as protecting business deadlines. That was one reason neighbors respected them. The following Sunday, their church organized a volunteer project to repair homes owned by elderly residents. Tonea donated building materials through her company. Scott arranged volunteers from his construction crew. Jude spent the morning carrying paintbrushes and helping wherever he could. The parking lot buzzed with activity. Neighbors cooked breakfast. Teenagers loaded trucks. Children planted flowers outside repaired homes. While volunteers worked together, Rochelle Benson walked over carrying a box of fresh pastries. She handed one to Tonea. "You've been working since sunrise." Tonea laughed. "You noticed? You never stop moving." "I'll rest tomorrow." Rochelle smiled. "You said that last week." Both women laughed. Rochelle glanced toward Scott, who was helping volunteers unload lumber. "He still looks at you the same way." Tonea followed her friend's eyes. Scott smiled after noticing her watching him. She smiled back without hesitation. Rochelle raised an eyebrow. "You still happy?" "Very. You didn't even think before answering." "I didn't need to." She meant every word. She trusted the life they had built together. Across town the following Monday, Scott attended another project meeting. The discussion ended earlier than expected. Most people gathered their papers and left. Scott and Maris remained behind reviewing one final drawing. Maris looked up. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "What made you choose construction?" Scott smiled. "My father worked around building projects most of his life." "So, you grew up around job sites?" "Pretty much." "What about your wife?" "She restores historic homes." Maris looked impressed. "So, both of you build things in different ways. Sounds like a good partnership." Scott looked down at the drawings for a moment before answering. "It used to feel simpler." Maris noticed the change in his expression. "Tough season?" Scott gave a small nod. "Something like that." She didn't ask another question. The conversation ended there. Neither of them realized that one short answer had quietly changed the direction of every conversation that would follow. Scott returned home that evening. Tonea had already finished dinner. Jude talked excitedly about an upcoming science competition. Scott listened, smiled, and congratulated him. The evening looked exactly like hundreds of evenings before it, but one difference had already appeared. It wasn't visible at the dinner table. It wasn't obvious in Scott's words. It began with a simple habit. For the first time in 16 years, another person had started occupying space in his thoughts long after the workday had ended. That small change was easy to ignore, at least for now. The construction project entered another demanding month. Scott and Maris now met several times each week to review updated drawings, contractor requests, and inspection reports. They worked well together because both valued preparation and efficiency. One afternoon, after a long planning meeting, Maris closed her notebook. "You've been working non-stop." Scott smiled. "Comes with the job. What do you do when you're not working?" "I don't have much free time." She laughed. "Neither do I." The conversation could have ended there. Instead, they walked toward the parking lot together. Maris looked at him. "I hope I'm not asking something too personal." Scott shrugged. "Go ahead. How do you balance work and family?" Scott looked ahead instead of answering immediately. "It hasn't been easy." Maris nodded. "I understand." He stopped there. He never mentioned that Tonea still believed they had a happy marriage. He never mentioned family dinners. He never mentioned church on Sundays. He never mentioned the evenings he spent helping Jude with homework. He simply allowed the conversation to end with the impression that life at home was no longer what it once had been. A few days later, several supervisors gathered for lunch near the construction trailers. The discussion shifted from work to family. One supervisor smiled at Scott. "So, how's married life treating you these days?" Scott gave a tired smile. "Some things change." The table became quiet. Nobody asked another question. Each person reached his own conclusion. Scott never corrected them. Over the next several weeks, that became his habit. He never directly said his marriage had ended. He simply answered questions in ways that encouraged people to believe it. Maris slowly accepted those quiet hints as truth. One afternoon, she handed Scott a revised blueprint. "I know this has probably been a difficult year." Scott looked at her. "It has. I hope things work out." "So do I." Again, he stopped talking before reaching the truth. Maris admired what she believed was his restraint. She thought he was protecting someone's privacy. She had no reason to suspect she was hearing only part of the story. Across town, Tonia continued building her business. The Victorian home was nearly complete. Fresh paint covered the walls. Original hardwood floors shined again. The front porch looked exactly as it had decades earlier. The homeowners walked through the finished house with tears in their eyes. One of them smiled at Tonia. "You gave us our home back." Tonia shook her head. "It was always your home." Driving away that afternoon, she felt grateful. Her business continued growing through honest work and satisfied clients. She never chased attention. She simply focused on doing every job well. That evening, she arrived home before Scott. Jude was already at the dining table finishing homework. She sat beside him. "Need any help?" "I think I've got it." "Let me know if you change your mind." A few minutes later, Scott walked through the front door. He looked exhausted. "Tough day?" Tonia asked. "Long meetings." She walked over and handed him a glass of water. "I'll have dinner ready in 10 minutes. "Thanks." Nothing about his answer seemed unusual. Construction projects often demanded extra hours. After dinner, Jude showed his parents another house design. Scott complimented the drawing before checking his phone. A new email had arrived from Maris about a design revision. Scott read it quickly. Tonia noticed. "Work again?" He nodded. "We've got another deadline." "I figured." She smiled. "Don't stay up too late." "I won't." She believed him. Over the next month, Scott spent more evenings answering work emails. Sometimes he stepped onto the back porch to finish phone calls. Sometimes he stayed in his home office after everyone went to bed. Tonia never questioned him. She had spent enough years around construction schedules to know deadlines could become demanding. One Saturday morning, Jude looked toward the empty driveway. "Dad, already left?" Tonia poured orange juice into a glass. "He had an early site meeting." Jude nodded. "He works a lot lately. He wants this project to succeed." "I guess." Tonia smiled. "It won't last forever." She believed the busy season would pass. Scott believed the extra hours gave him room to keep two different parts of his life separate. Every explanation became easier. Every omission became more natural. Every conversation required less effort than the one before. The distance between him and Tonia did not appear overnight. It grew one decision at a time. At home, she still trusted the man she had spent 16 years loving. At work, Maris increasingly believed she was getting to know a man whose marriage already belonged to the past. Scott had never spoken those exact words. He simply allowed both women to believe two completely different versions of the same life. Neither realized those carefully chosen omissions were laying the foundation for the painful truth that would eventually reach them both. Spring arrived across North Carolina, bringing longer days and a busier construction season. Scott's commercial project entered its final stages. Every week required inspections, design approvals, and meetings with contractors. Because Maris supervised the architectural changes, she and Scott spent more time together than ever before. Their conversations no longer ended when meetings ended. One afternoon, after reviewing the final plans for a parking structure, Maris looked toward the break area. "I skipped lunch again." Scott smiled. "So did I. There's a cafe across the street. We've got 30 minutes. That's enough." They walked there together. At first they talked about work. Then the conversation shifted to family, childhood, and future goals. Maris spoke about wanting children someday. Scott listened quietly. She smiled. "I've always wanted a home where everyone actually enjoys coming back every evening." Scott nodded. "So have I." She believed he was describing the future. Scott knew he was describing the life he already had. Lunch together became a regular habit. Neither planned it. It simply became easier than eating alone. Meanwhile, Tonia continued growing Stewart Restoration Group. Her reputation spread through nearby counties. because homeowners trusted her honesty. One morning, she met a retired couple whose farmhouse had been damaged by years of neglect. After walking through every room, Tonia closed her notebook. "We can save it." The husband smiled. "We were afraid we'd have to tear everything down." "You won't." The wife wiped away tears. "This house belonged to my parents." Tonia nodded. "We'll protect what matters." Within days, her crew began restoring another family home instead of replacing it. Her employees admired the way she treated every customer with patience and respect. Business continued growing through referrals alone. That evening, she arrived home carrying a folder filled with new contracts. Jude met her at the door. "Mom, guess what?" "What happened?" "I got first place on my science project." She hugged him immediately. "I knew you could do it." Scott arrived home 20 minutes later. Jude rushed over holding the ribbon. Scott smiled proudly. "That's my boy." The family celebrated over dinner. Tonia baked Jude's favorite dessert. Scott congratulated him several times. Looking at the three of them together, nobody would have believed another relationship was slowly entering Scott's life. The following week, another project deadline kept Scott and Maris at the office long after most employees had left. Stacks of blueprints covered the conference table. Maris leaned back in her chair. "We finally finished." Scott checked the time. "It's almost 8. She laughed. "We've been here all day." Outside, heavy rain had started falling. Scott looked through the window. "That doesn't look like it's stopping." Maris picked up her jacket. "I forgot my umbrella." "I'll walk you to your car." They hurried through the rain together. By the time they reached the parking lot, both of them were laughing. Maris looked at him. "I haven't laughed this much in weeks." Scott smiled. "I needed it too." For a few seconds, they simply looked at each other. Scott knew he should get into his truck and drive home. Instead, he stepped closer. Maris did not move away. Their first kiss lasted only a moment. Neither spoke afterward. Scott drove home in silence, trying to convince himself it had been a mistake. When he entered the house, Tonia was folding laundry in the living room. She smiled. "Long day?" "The longest yet." "I kept dinner warm." "Thanks." She never questioned the rain on his jacket. She never questioned the expression on his face. She believed another demanding workday had finally ended. The next morning, Scott promised himself the kiss would never happen again. By lunchtime, he was meeting Maris for coffee. A week later, they were having dinner after work. Soon they began seeing each other outside the construction project. Scott carefully arranged every meeting around his family schedule. If Jude had a school event, Scott attended. If Tonia planned family dinner, he arrived on time. If Maris wanted to see him, he found another excuse to leave the house afterward. His calendar became divided into 2 separate lives. One belonged to his wife and son, the other belonged to Maris. Neither life crossed into the other. For several months, Scott believed he had complete control. Tonia noticed only that his workload continued increasing. She often reminded him not to exhaust himself. "You've been working every weekend." "We're close to finishing the project." "It'll be nice when life slows down." "It will." He answered with confidence, though he already knew another reason kept him away from home. Maris also believed the future was getting closer. One evening, while they watched the sunset from a quiet park after dinner, she reached for Scott's hand. "I've never felt this close to anyone." Scott squeezed her hand. "Neither have I." The words came easily. He never mentioned that Tonia was waiting for him at home. He never mentioned that Jude had texted asking when his father would be back. Instead, he looked at Maris and continued building a future that depended on keeping his present hidden. Each passing week made the truth harder to tell. Each passing week made the 2 lives harder to separate. Scott still believed he could protect both. He had no idea that every promise he made was leading him toward the day when both worlds would finally meet. Chuang Ti Ding Duan. Scott's relationship with Maris continued for several months without anyone questioning it. The construction project was nearly finished, but Scott always found another reason to see her. A design review became dinner. A site inspection became an evening walk. A planning session became another promise about the future. Maris believed each day brought them closer to living openly together. Scott kept telling himself he would tell the truth soon. He never did. One Monday morning, Maris arrived late for a project meeting. Scott noticed immediately. "You feeling okay?" She forced a smile. "I've been tired lately. You should get that checked. I already made an appointment." He nodded and returned to work. 2 days later, Scott received a text from her. "Can we meet after work? It's important." His stomach tightened. "I'll be there." That evening they met at the same quiet restaurant they often visited. Maris looked nervous. She pushed a small white envelope across the table. Scott looked at it. "What's this?" "My test results." He opened the envelope. Inside was a medical report confirming the pregnancy. Scott looked back at her. She smiled through tears. "We're having a baby." For several seconds, he simply stared at the paper. The reality settled in quickly. This was no longer a relationship he could quietly hide. A child changed everything. Maris reached across the table and held his hand. "I know this wasn't planned." Scott nodded. "No, but we'll figure it out." He forced a smile. "We will." She searched his face. "You're happy, aren't you?" Scott squeezed her hand. "I am." Part of that answer was true. He already loved the idea of his unborn child. The other part stayed locked inside him. He knew every decision he had avoided was now waiting for him. Maris smiled with relief. "I was scared you'd panic." "I won't run away." "I knew you wouldn't." She believed every word. On the drive home, Scott replayed the conversation again and again. He knew he should tell Tonia. He knew delaying the truth would only make things worse. By the time he reached home, he convinced himself to wait one more week. 1 week became 2. 2 weeks became a month. At home, life continued as it always had. Tonia expanded her business into another county after winning 2 large restoration contracts. Isaiah Stewart congratulated her during a site visit. "You've built something people trust." Tonia smiled. "I've had good people helping me." "You've earned every bit of it." She thanked him and continued checking the work. That evening she shared the good news with Scott. "We signed both contracts." Scott smiled. "Congratulations. It'll mean hiring more people." "You deserve it." He sounded supportive. His mind was somewhere else. Tonia noticed he looked distracted. "You still carrying the whole construction project?" "It's almost finished." "You'll finally get some rest." "I hope so." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you." Scott forced another smile. "Thanks." The words stayed with him long after dinner ended. He was receiving encouragement from the wife he was preparing to betray. Meanwhile, Maris began making plans for their future. She visited baby stores. She collected nursery ideas. She saved pictures of family homes she hoped they might buy one day. One Saturday afternoon, she showed Scott several photos on her phone. "I like this room." Scott looked. "It has plenty of space. A little girl could grow up here." He nodded. "I can see that." Maris smiled. "When do you think everything will finally be settled?" Scott knew exactly what she meant. "My divorce." He answered carefully. "I'm working through it." She looked relieved. "I don't want to pressure you." "I know. I just want us to start our life together before the baby comes." Scott took her hand. "We will." "When?" He hesitated for only a moment. "Soon." That single word became the answer he repeated every time she asked. Soon. Soon became another week. Soon became another month. Maris never questioned him because she believed legal matters simply took time. She had no idea no divorce had even begun. Back at home, Jude started talking about summer vacation. One evening, he spread brochures across the dining table. "Can we still go to the mountains this year?" Tonia smiled. "I'd love that." She looked at Scott. "What do you think?" Scott looked at the brochures. "We'll make it happen." Jude grinned. "I'll start planning." Tonia laughed. "You always do." Scott watched his son talk excitedly about hiking trails and fishing. He smiled. Inside, he knew he was making promises to 2 different families. Both believed they had his future. Only one knew his past. Several weeks later, Maris attended another doctor's appointment. Scott joined her. For the first time, they heard their baby's heartbeat. Maris wiped away tears. "That's our daughter." Scott listened without speaking. The steady rhythm filled the room. At that moment, he loved the child they had created. He also knew every passing day made telling the truth more difficult. When they left the clinic, Maris wrapped her arm around his. "I'm so glad we're doing this together." Scott looked at her and nodded. "So am I." He wanted to believe those words. Instead of telling Tanea the truth that night, he convinced himself there would be a better time. There never seemed to be one. Every delay made the truth heavier. Every promise made the future more complicated. Scott believed he was protecting everyone from pain. In reality, he was allowing the damage to grow with every passing day. Summer arrived just as Scott's commercial project reached completion. The final inspections passed. The client approved the building. Executives congratulated Scott for delivering one of the company's most successful projects. His reputation continued growing. Outside the office, his relationship with Maris also grew stronger. Inside his home, Tonia continued believing the busiest season of Scott's career had finally ended. She expected life to return to normal. Instead, Scott found new reasons to stay away. One Saturday morning, Scott received a call from his father. "Can you stop by the house today?" Alton asked. "Everything okay?" "I've been cleaning out old files." "I'll come over this afternoon." A few hours later, Scott pulled into his father's driveway. Alton was waiting inside the garage, surrounded by shelves stacked with storage boxes filled with business records, family papers, and legal files collected over many years. "I've been trying to organize this place," Alton said. Scott smiled. "You've been saying that for years." "I finally started." Scott picked up one of the boxes. "What are we keeping?" "Only the important things." The two men worked quietly for nearly an hour. Old tax records went into one pile. Expired insurance papers went into another. Near the bottom of a dusty filing cabinet, Alton found a thick envelope. He brushed away the dust and looked at the front. His expression changed immediately. Scott noticed. "What is it?" Alton slowly removed several documents. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second. Finally, he looked directly at his son. "Do you remember signing this?" Scott accepted the papers. The first page looked familiar. Within seconds, he recognized every signature. His own, Tonea's, the attorney who had prepared the agreement years earlier. Scott frowned. "I haven't seen this in years." "You should read it again." Scott skimmed through several pages. His face tightened. This was after the property investment. Alton nodded. "You and Tanea almost lost everything." Scott remembered those difficult months clearly. A failed real estate investment had placed enormous pressure on their finances. To protect both their family and the business they were rebuilding together, their attorney had recommended a detailed postnuptial agreement. After discussing it carefully, Scott and Tonia had both signed it. Life improved. The agreement was placed in storage. Over time, Scott stopped thinking about it completely. Alton pointed to one section. "Read that paragraph." Scott read every word slowly. The clause stated that if either spouse secretly established another family while still legally married and publicly represented that relationship through deception before ending the marriage legally, the faithful spouse would receive specific jointly protected assets once the facts were verified. Scott lowered the papers. "I forgot this was even here." "I didn't." Scott looked away. Alton watched him carefully. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Scott hesitated. "No." Alton remained silent for only a moment. "I've lived long enough to recognize when my son isn't telling me everything." Scott rubbed his forehead. "It's complicated." Complicated usually means someone is getting hurt. Scott took a slow breath. "I've been seeing someone." Alton closed his eyes. "How long?" "Several months." "Does Tonea know?" "No." "Does this woman know you're still married?" Scott looked at the floor. "She believes the marriage is ending." Alton's voice became firmer. "Believes?" "I never actually told her it was over. You allowed her to believe it." Scott said nothing. Alton continued. Who is she? Maris. And she's involved with you seriously? Scott nodded. She's expecting our baby. The garage became very still. Alton sat down slowly. He looked at his son with disappointment instead of anger. I raised you better than this. Well, Scott lowered his head. I know. No, you don't. Alton held up the agreement. This isn't only about property. It's about your word. You stood before your family, your church, and your wife. You made promises. Scott spoke quietly. I never meant for any of this to happen. It happened because of hundreds of choices. Alton placed the agreement on the workbench. You still have time to do the right thing. Scott looked up. I don't know how. You start with the truth. I'll lose everything. Alton answered without hesitation. You've already started losing everything. Scott remained quiet. Alton continued. You need to tell Tanea yourself. You need to stop letting Maris believe something that isn't true. You need to face the consequences before they become worse. Scott nodded but offered no commitment. I'll handle it. Alton recognized that answer immediately. It was another delay. When? Soon. Alton slowly shook his head. That word won't solve this. Scott folded the agreement and placed it back inside the envelope. I appreciate the warning. This isn't a warning. Alton looked directly into his son's eyes. It's your last opportunity to choose honesty before your choices begin deciding your future. Scott left with the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside him. Several times during the drive home, he glanced at it. He knew exactly what he should do. Tell Tonia the truth. Tell Maris the truth. End the deception before anyone else was hurt. Instead, he convinced himself there was still time. He placed the envelope inside a locked drawer in his home office when he arrived home. He never mentioned it to Tonia. He never mentioned it to Maris. He believed hiding one more document would also hide the consequences attached to it. He was completely wrong. The agreement had not disappeared. It was simply waiting for the day his own actions would activate every promise he had forgotten. 3 days passed after Alton confronted Scott. He waited for his son to do the right thing. Every morning, he expected a phone call. Every evening, he expected Scott to admit the truth to Tonia. The call never came. By the 4th day, Alton accepted that Scott had made his choice. If he remained silent, an innocent woman would continue living inside a lie. That afternoon, he called Tonia. Do you have time to meet me? Of course, Tonia replied. Is everything all right? I'd rather explain in person. An hour later, they met inside a quiet coffee shop a few miles from Tuane's office. Tonia immediately noticed the concern on Alton's face. You've got me worried. Alton took a deep breath. I wish this conversation wasn't necessary. Tonia waited patiently. Alton placed a large envelope on the table. I found these while cleaning old family records. Tonia looked at the envelope. What is it? Our postnuptial agreement. She looked surprised. I haven't seen that in years. Neither had Scott. Her expression changed. You've spoken to Scott? I have. Tonia slowly opened the envelope. She recognized the signatures immediately. Hers, Scott's, the attorney's. She quietly turned each page. Then Alton pointed to one clause. Read this carefully. Tonia read every word. Her eyes stopped on the section explaining the consequences if one spouse secretly established another family while still married and publicly presented that relationship through deception. She looked back at Alton. Why are you showing me this now? His answer came without hesitation. Because Scott is having an affair. Tonia stared at him. She searched his face, hoping she had misunderstood. What did you say? Scott has been involved with another woman for several months. Tonia lowered her eyes to the table. Her hands tightened around the agreement. She remained calm. What else? Alton admired her strength. The woman is expecting his child. Tonia closed her eyes for only a moment. When she opened them again, her voice remained steady. Does she know he's still married? No. Does Scott know about this agreement? I reminded him. And? He chose to ignore it. Tonia nodded slowly. She asked only one more question. Is everything you've told me true? Every word. She looked back at the papers. Her marriage had changed forever in less than 5 minutes. Yet she refused to make a public scene. She refused to let anger make her next decision. Instead, she folded the agreement carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. I need legal advice. Alton nodded. I know exactly who you should call. The following morning, Tonia met attorney, Darian Cross. She handed him the agreement. I need you to tell me one thing. He adjusted his glasses and began reading every page. Several minutes later, he looked up. This agreement is still valid. Tonia remained quiet. Can it still be enforced? Yes. What happens now? Darian folded his hands. That depends. On what? Has Scott publicly introduced this other woman as his new family while still legally married to you? Tonia shook her head. No. Has he announced a marriage? No. Has he openly presented their child as part of a new family before ending your marriage? Not that I know. Darian nodded. Then the agreement has not reached the final legal requirement. Tonia listened carefully. So I can't act yet. You can begin preparing. But if you move too early, this particular clause cannot be enforced. She understood immediately. You believe he'll eventually cross that line. Darian answered honestly. If Scott has ignored his father's warning, there's a strong chance he believes there are no legal consequences. Tonia remained calm. What do you recommend? Darian slid the agreement back across the desk. Do nothing publicly. No confrontation. No arguments. No accusations. Continue living your normal life. Tonia looked at him. And wait? Yes. If Scott publicly establishes another family before legally ending this marriage, he will activate this agreement himself. Tonia thought about everything she had heard. She had every reason to confront Scott that evening. She had every reason to demand answers. Instead, she chose something much harder. Patience, not because she was weak, because she wanted the truth to expose itself completely. Before leaving, she looked at Darian. When the time comes... He nodded. I'll be ready. Tonia returned to work that afternoon exactly as she always did. She walked through another restoration project. She spoke with her employees. She checked measurements. She approved materials. No one suspected her life had changed only hours earlier. That evening, she arrived home before Scott. She greeted Jude with a smile, asked about school, helped him finish homework, prepared dinner. When Scott walked through the front door, she welcomed him exactly as she had every evening before. Scott smiled, believing his secret remained hidden. He had no idea that Tonia already knew the truth. She was no longer waiting to discover what he had done. She was waiting for the moment his own choices would complete the evidence he believed no one would ever see. Tuang Ti Ding Duan. The morning after meeting Darian Cross, Tonia made one decision. She would not confront Scott. She would let him continue making his own choices. If he wanted to tell the truth, he still had the opportunity. If he refused, every decision would become part of the evidence. She placed the postnuptial agreement inside a locked drawer at her office. Only she, Darian, and Alton knew it was there. Life at home continued exactly as before. Tonia woke early, prepared breakfast, checked Jude's school schedule, left for her restoration projects. Scott believed nothing had changed. That confidence made him less careful. He spent more evenings with Maris. He answered fewer calls from home. He often claimed another meeting had been added to his schedule. Tonia never questioned him. She simply listened. Every explanation became another piece of the truth he was creating himself. Meanwhile, Jude slowly began noticing changes. One evening he looked around the dinner table. "Dad's late again?" Tonia smiled gently. He said work is keeping him busy. Jude nodded. He misses dinner a lot now. He has a big project. Jude accepted the answer, but it stayed on his mind. Scott arrived almost an hour later. "I'm sorry." "No problem," Tonia replied calmly. "We kept your plate warm." Scott thanked her and sat down. Jude looked at him. Are things slowing down yet? Almost. You've been saying that for months. Scott forced a smile. We're close. Jude nodded and returned to eating. Tonia watched quietly. She noticed every promise. She said nothing. Across town, Maris was preparing for another doctor's appointment. Scott met her outside the clinic. She handed him several ultrasound pictures. Our daughter is getting bigger. Scott smiled as he looked at the images. She is. Maris wrapped her arm around him. I've been thinking about names. Scott laughed. We've still got time. I know, she smiled. I just like planning. Inside the examination room, the doctor confirmed the pregnancy was progressing well. Maris left happier than ever. On the drive home, she looked at Scott. I want our daughter to grow up in a peaceful home. So do I. I don't want secrets. Scott tightened his hands on the steering wheel. There won't be. Maris believed him completely. Back at Stewart Restoration Group, Tonia signed another contract. Business had never been stronger. Isaiah reviewed the paperwork and smiled. You've built something remarkable. We've worked hard, and people trust you. Tonia nodded. Trust takes years. She spoke the words calmly. Only she knew how much they now meant. That evening, Jude walked into Scott's home office. Dad? Scott quickly locked his computer screen. What's up? I wanted help with my math assignment. Scott looked at the clock. I've got to finish something first. It'll only take a few minutes. Maybe later. Jude tried to hide his disappointment. Okay. He walked out quietly. Tonia saw him leaving the office. What happened? Dad's busy. I'll help you. Together they finished the assignment at the kitchen table. Scott remained inside his office, sending messages to Maris. Later that night, Tonia noticed the office light was still on. She walked past the closed door. She never tried to open it. She already knew enough. She no longer needed to search for answers. Scott continued creating them himself. The following weekend, Maris visited a furniture store. She sent Scott pictures of baby cribs, rocking chairs, and nursery colors. He replied to every message. I like that one. That looks perfect. Our daughter will love it. Maris smiled every time her phone vibrated. She believed they were building a future together. That same afternoon, Tony and Jude planted flowers along the front walkway of their home. Jude stepped back to admire their work. Looks better already. Tonia smiled. It does. Jude looked toward the empty driveway. Dad said he'd help. He had another meeting. Jude sighed. He never misses work. Tonia gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes adults make choices they don't realize affect everyone else. Jude looked at her. You think he's working too much? I think your father has a lot on his mind. Jude accepted the answer. Tonia did not criticize Scott. She refused to place that burden on her son. A few days later, Scott met Maris for dinner. She reached across the table and smiled. I've started thinking about a baby shower. Scott smiled back. Already? Our families will want to celebrate. He nodded. They will. I want everyone to know about our daughter. Scott agreed without thinking. I'll make it special. Maris squeezed his hand. I knew you would. Scott believed he was making another loving promise. He failed to recognize that every promise pushed him closer to the very moment Alton had warned him about. Tonia continued living with patience. Maris continued living with hope. Jude continued waiting for his father to come home earlier. Scott continued believing he could satisfy everyone. He never realized that every promise to one family became another step toward losing the other. Chuang Ti Ding Duan. Nearly 2 months passed. Maris entered the final months of her pregnancy. Scott divided his time between work, home, and the life he was building with her. The balancing act had become routine. He believed he was managing everything. He was wrong. One Saturday morning, Maris spread several decoration ideas across her dining table. Blue flowers, white tablecloths, small gift boxes. She smiled as Scott looked through them. I think it's time. Scott looked up. For what? Our baby shower. He smiled. I was wondering when you'd bring it up. I've been waiting until we were closer. Scott picked up one of the designs. This looks nice. I want something simple. You deserve more than simple. Maris laughed. I don't need anything expensive. I want our daughter welcomed by everyone who loves her. Scott nodded. We'll make it unforgettable. Maris smiled. I'd like our families and friends there. They'll be there. She looked at him. Will your family come? Scott answered without thinking. Yes. He had no plan. He simply wanted the conversation to move forward. Maris trusted him completely. During the following week, Scott reserved a ballroom overlooking Lake Norman. He approved the decorations. He confirmed the catering. He selected the guest list. Business associates, neighbors, church friends, relatives, co-workers. Everyone received an invitation. Scott believed he was announcing the beginning of a new chapter. He never stopped to consider what that announcement meant while he remained legally married. Several days later, Maris received the finished digital invitation. She smiled as she read it aloud. Please join us as we celebrate our growing family and prepare to welcome our beautiful daughter. She looked at Scott. I love it. So do I. I'll send it tonight. Scott nodded. Go ahead. Within minutes, the invitation appeared on phones across the community. Guests began responding immediately. Congratulations filled the comments. People promised to attend. Several shared the invitation with friends and relatives. By the next morning, hundreds of people had seen it. Across town, Tonea was reviewing restoration plans when her phone vibrated. A church friend had forwarded the invitation. She opened it. The smiling photograph showed Scott standing beside Maris. One hand rested on her shoulder. The other rested on her pregnant stomach. Below the photograph appeared the words, "Celebrating our growing family." Tonea read every line carefully. She never looked away. When she reached the event date, she quietly locked her phone. She already understood what Scott had done. He had publicly introduced another family while remaining her husband. She immediately called Darian Cross. I've received something you need to see. Can you come to my office? I'll be there within the hour. Tonea arrived carrying nothing except her phone. She placed it on Darian's desk. He opened the invitation. He read every word. Then he looked back at her. Has this been sent publicly? Yes. To family, friends, co-workers, and business associates. Darian nodded. That's exactly what I needed to confirm. He printed a copy of the invitation and placed it beside the postnuptial agreement. He compared both documents carefully. Several minutes later, he closed the file. He did it. Tonea remained calm. What does that mean? He has publicly presented another family while remaining legally married. He has announced that family to the community. He has done it voluntarily. Tonea looked at the invitation again. So the agreement is active? Darian answered without hesitation. Once the event takes place exactly as announced, every remaining legal requirement will be satisfied. She nodded. So, I continue waiting. Yes. Do not confront him. Do not cancel the event. Let Scott complete the decision he has already made. Tonea stood. When it's over, we move immediately. She thanked him and left the office. That evening, Scott returned home carrying takeout for dinner. I thought we'd have something different tonight. Tonea smiled politely. That was thoughtful. Jude joined them at the table. He talked about school. He talked about basketball practice. He laughed about a joke one of his teachers had made. Scott laughed with him. Tonea watched quietly. She realized this could be one of the last evenings her family would ever sit together under the same roof. She refused to let sadness control her. Scott noticed nothing unusual. He believed his secret remained safe. The following week, guests continued accepting the invitation. The event planner confirmed the final guest count. The florist ordered hundreds of blue and white flowers. The caterer finalized the menu. Everything moved exactly as Scott wanted. Alton learned about the baby shower from another relative. He immediately understood what his son had done. He called Scott. Have you announced this publicly? Yes. You ignored everything I told you. It's only a baby shower. No. Alton's voice became firm. It's the decision I warned you never to make. Scott dismissed the concern. I know what I'm doing. Alton ended the call without another word. He immediately contacted Tonea. I've seen the invitation. So have I, she replied. He still doesn't understand. He will. The date of the baby shower drew closer. Scott counted the days with excitement. Maris dreamed about introducing their daughter to everyone they loved. Tonea prepared quietly with Darian. Alton watched with a heavy heart, knowing exactly how the day would end. None of them needed to change Scott's path anymore. He had already chosen it himself. The celebration he believed would welcome his future was about to become the day every hidden choice finally stood in full view. Chuang Ti Ding Duan. Saturday afternoon arrived with clear skies over Lake Norman. The ballroom overlooked the water exactly as Scott had planned. Blue and white flowers decorated every table. Wrapped gifts filled one corner of the room. Soft music welcomed guests as they entered. Maris smiled at everyone who walked through the doors. She greeted relatives, co-workers, church friends, and neighbors with genuine happiness. Many guests congratulated her. We're so happy for both of you. You'll be wonderful parents. What a beautiful celebration. She thanked every person with a smile. Scott moved through the ballroom shaking hands. Several executives from his construction company congratulated him on completing the commercial project. One executive smiled. You've had quite a year. Scott laughed. I have. Another guest added, looks like life is treating you well. It certainly is. Across the room, photographers captured pictures of Scott and Maris beside a large display that read, Celebrating our growing family. Maris looked at Scott. I can't believe everyone came. Scott smiled. I told you they would. She squeezed his hand. Our daughter is already loved. Scott nodded. She is. Meanwhile, outside the ballroom, another vehicle entered the parking lot. Tonea stepped out, wearing a simple navy dress. She carried the same cream-colored envelope Darian had prepared. Darian stood beside her, holding a leather portfolio. A few seconds later, another car arrived. Alton quietly joined them. None of them spoke about what was about to happen. They had already agreed on every step. Darian looked at Tonea. Are you ready? She answered without hesitation, yes. Inside the ballroom, guests continued arriving. The event planner checked the seating list. The caterers served refreshments. Children laughed near the gift table. Everything looked exactly like a joyful family celebration. Scott believed the hardest part of his life was finally over. He had no idea Tonea was already inside the building. She entered through a side entrance with Darian and Alton. Instead of walking into the ballroom immediately, they remained in a private hallway where they could hear the celebration without being seen. Darian checked his watch. We wait until he addresses the guests. Tonea nodded. She showed no anger. She showed no fear. She had already accepted what Scott had chosen. Inside the ballroom, the event host stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. The room became quiet. We're here to celebrate Scott and Maris as they prepare to welcome their beautiful daughter. Applause filled the ballroom. The host smiled toward Scott. I think everyone would enjoy hearing a few words. More applause followed. Scott walked confidently onto the stage. He adjusted the microphone. He looked across the crowd with complete confidence. So many familiar faces. He smiled warmly. Thank you for coming. Several guests nodded. This past year has taught me that life doesn't always follow the plans we make. People listened closely, but sometimes life gives us another chance. Applause followed immediately. Scott looked toward Maris. I'm grateful for the family we're building together. I can't wait to welcome our daughter into the world. The audience applauded again. Maris smiled proudly. She believed this was the happiest day of her life. Near the hallway entrance, Darian quietly looked toward Tonea. The agreement requires a public declaration. Tonea watched Scott continue speaking. He thanked friends. He thanked co-workers. He thanked everyone for supporting what he called his growing family. Every sentence became part of the public record. Darian quietly closed his portfolio. He has completed every legal requirement. Tonia gave a small nod. It is time. Without showing anger or raising her voice, she picked up the cream-colored envelope. She walked toward the ballroom doors. Darian followed. Alton walked several steps behind them. Inside, Scott had just finished speaking. Guests rose to their feet, applauding. Maris reached for his hand. Both smiled as they looked across the room. Neither noticed the ballroom doors opening. Several guests near the entrance turned first. Their applause stopped. People standing beside them also turned around. Within seconds, dozens of eyes shifted toward the doorway. The applause faded across the ballroom one section at a time. Scott noticed people looking past him. His smile slowly disappeared. He turned toward the entrance. Tonia stood quietly inside the ballroom. The cream-colored envelope rested in her hands. Darian stood beside her. Alton stood behind them. Every person in the room immediately understood that the celebration was no longer about a baby shower. It had become the moment the truth had finally arrived. Scott stared toward the ballroom entrance. His face lost every trace of confidence. Tonia walked forward at a steady pace. She carried the cream-colored envelope in one hand. Darian Cross walked beside her with his leather portfolio. Alton Higgs followed a few steps behind. Every guest watched without speaking. Maris looked from Scott to Tonia. She smiled politely, believing another guest had arrived late. Then she noticed Scott's expression. She touched his arm. "Scott, what's wrong?" He did not answer. Tonia continued walking until she reached the stage. She stopped only a few feet away. She looked directly at Scott. For 16 years she had stood beside him through every success and every setback. Now she stood before him for a completely different reason. Scott finally found his voice. "Tonia." She calmly extended the cream-colored envelope. "I believed these belonged to you." Scott looked at the envelope, but made no effort to take it. "What is this? Open it." Her voice remained calm. No anger, no shouting, no accusations, only certainty. Scott slowly accepted the envelope. His hands shook as he opened it. The first page carried the heading he recognized immediately. Post-nuptial agreement. His breathing changed. He turned another page. Every signature was there. His, Tonia's, the attorney's, the date they had signed it, after recovering from their failed property investment years earlier. Scott looked toward his father. Alton met his eyes without looking away. Scott continued reading. His eyes stopped on one paragraph. He read it again. Then, a third time. The clause was exactly as his father had shown him. If either spouse secretly established another family while still legally married and publicly presented that family through deception before legally ending the marriage, the protected assets identified in the agreement would transfer according to its terms once the conditions were satisfied. Scott whispered, "No." Darian stepped forward. "Mr. Higgs, I represent Mrs. Tonia Stewart." The ballroom remained completely focused on him. Darian opened his portfolio. Several months ago, this agreement was reviewed and confirmed to remain legally enforceable. Scott stared at him. Darian continued, "Today, in front of family members, business associates, church friends, neighbors, and invited guests, you publicly introduced another family while remaining legally married to Mrs. Stewart." Scott immediately interrupted. "This isn't the place." Darian answered calmly, "You selected the place. You invited these witnesses. You publicly described this gathering as a celebration of your growing family." He lifted the printed invitation. "You distributed this announcement yourself." Several guests quietly looked at one another. Many had received the same invitation. Darian continued, "Your public statements today confirmed exactly what this agreement describes." Scott looked around the room. For the first time, he realized every guest had become a witness. Maris stepped closer. She looked at Scott with growing confusion. What agreement? Scott remained silent. She looked at Tonia. "Who are you?" Tonia answered without raising her voice. "My name is Tonia Stewart." She looked directly at Maris. "I am Scott's wife." The words struck the room with overwhelming force. Maris immediately turned toward Scott. "Wife?" Scott lowered his head. "You told me your divorce was almost finished." Scott struggled to answer. You told me you were already living separate lives. His silence answered every question. Maris stepped backward, her face filled with disbelief. You never filed for divorce? Scott could not deny it. No. Maris covered her mouth. You let me believe all of it. Scott reached toward her. Maris. She stepped away. Don't. Her eyes filled with tears. Our daughter is coming into this world because I trusted you. Scott tried again. I was going to fix everything. Tonia spoke for the first time since introducing herself. The truth doesn't become smaller because someone delays telling it. Scott looked at her. He had no response. Darian removed another document from his portfolio. This is the formal legal notice confirming Mrs. Stewart's intent to enforce the agreement according to its terms. Scott accepted the document without reading it. He already understood what it contained. Everything his father had warned him about months earlier had become reality, not because someone trapped him, because he ignored every opportunity to choose honesty. Scott slowly looked toward Alton. His father stood quietly near the front of the ballroom. Disappointment covered his face. Scott realized there was nothing left to explain. Every promise, every excuse, every delay, every decision had brought him to this exact moment. The celebration he believed would introduce his future had become the place where every hidden truth stood before the people whose respect he had spent years earning. Chuang di ding duan. No one in the ballroom moved. Scott stood frozen with the legal documents in his hands. Maris looked at him through tears. You told me you were almost divorced. Scott looked at her. I wanted to tell you. She shook her head. You had months. You let me plan a future. You let me believe we were starting a family the right way. Scott reached toward her. I never wanted to hurt you. Maris stepped back again. You already did. She turned toward Tonia. I'm so sorry. I never knew. Tonia looked at her calmly. I believe you. You were lied to just as I was. Maris lowered her head. Tears rolled down her face. She realized every plan she had made had been built on false promises. Scott looked at Tonia. I'm sorry. She answered, without anger. Your apology belongs to everyone whose trust you broke. Scott had no answer. Darian quietly collected the signed acknowledgement that Scott had received the legal notice. The paperwork was complete. The agreement had officially moved into enforcement. Several guests slowly stepped away from the stage. The excitement that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier disappeared. People whispered to one another. Many looked at Scott with disappointment. Others looked toward Tonia with sympathy. Several business executives who had worked with Scott exchanged concerned looks. One executive spoke quietly to another. If he could hide something this serious for this long, what else has he hidden? Another executive nodded. Trust is difficult to rebuild. Scott heard every word. His professional reputation was beginning to disappear before his eyes. Church friends quietly gathered their belongings. Neighbors who had admired Scott and Tonia for years walked toward the exit without saying a word. The celebration ended without music, without speeches, without gifts being opened. One family after another left the ballroom. Near the entrance, Alton finally walked toward his son. Scott looked at him. You knew this would happen. Alton answered immediately. I warned you this would happen. Scott lowered his head. I thought I had more time. I told you to tell the truth. I told you to stop before another child became part of your decisions. Scott closed his eyes. I know. I told you to read that agreement. I know. Alton looked directly at him. You ignored every warning because you believed you could control the outcome. Scott remained silent. Alton continued. You weren't defeated by that agreement. You were defeated by your own choices. Scott accepted every word. He knew his father was right. Across the ballroom, Maris sat quietly in a chair. She held one hand over her stomach. The future she had imagined no longer existed. Tonia walked over to her. Maris looked up. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to explain anything, Tonia replied. I truly didn't know. I believe you. Maris wiped away another tear. I would have never agreed to this if I'd known. Tonia looked at her gently. Take care of yourself and your daughter. Those words surprised Maris. After everything that had happened, Tonia showed kindness instead of bitterness. Maris nodded. I will. Tonia turned and walked back toward Darian. There was nothing more she needed to say. The legal process would now continue through the proper channels. She had no interest in humiliating anyone further. Scott watched Tonia leave. For the first time, he understood exactly what he had lost. It wasn't only his marriage. It wasn't only his reputation. It was the respect of the woman who had stood beside him for 16 years. At that moment, the ballroom doors opened once more. Jude stepped inside. A family friend had brought him after hearing about the event ending unexpectedly. He looked around the nearly empty ballroom. The decorations were still hanging. Wrapped gifts remained unopened. Guests were leaving quietly. Then he saw his parents standing apart from each other. He walked toward Scott. Dad. Oh. Scott looked at his son. Jude noticed the documents still in his father's hands. He looked at Toné, then back at Scott. His voice remained calm. Is everything they're saying true? Scott could not lie anymore. Yes. Jude lowered his eyes. For several seconds, he searched for words. Finally, he looked back at his father. You always told me that a man's word is the most valuable thing he owns. Scott felt his chest tighten. Jude continued, I believed you. Those 3 words struck harder than every legal document Scott had received that afternoon. Jude quietly walked to his mother. Tonia placed an arm around his shoulders. Together they walked toward the ballroom doors. Neither of them looked back. Scott remained standing where they had left him. The flowers, the decorations, the unopened gifts, the empty tables. Everything around him reminded him of the future he thought he was celebrating. Instead, it had become the place where every hidden decision finally demanded its price. Chuang Ti Ding Duan. The Monday after the baby shower, Scott walked into his company headquarters, carrying the same briefcase he had used for years. The building looked the same. The people inside did not. Co-workers greeted him politely, but the warmth was gone. Several conversations stopped as he walked past. Scott understood why. By the time the workday began, everyone had heard what happened at the baby shower. An hour later, he received a message from Human Resources asking him to report to a conference room. When Scott entered, several senior executives were waiting. No one smiled. One executive spoke first. We're not here to discuss your private marriage. Scott nodded. We're here because your personal decisions have affected the company's reputation. Another executive placed several printed articles on the table. Local business blogs had already reported what happened at the baby shower. Photos from the event had spread across social media. Scott looked at the pages without speaking. The first executive continued. Our clients expect honesty. Our employees expect leadership. Trust is part of your position. Scott lowered his head. I understand. You'll be placed on administrative leave while we complete an internal review. Scott accepted the decision. He offered no argument. He knew he had lost the right to defend himself. He quietly gathered his belongings and left the building. Outside, he sat inside his truck for several minutes. For the first time since everything had collapsed, he stopped blaming circumstances. Every consequence traced back to one decision. He had chosen deception. Later that week, Scott met Darian Cross to begin the divorce process. The meeting remained respectful. Tonia had already signed the necessary documents. She requested no unnecessary delays. She requested no public fight. She requested only a fair conclusion based on the agreement both of them had signed years earlier. Scott read every page carefully. He signed each document without objection. Darian looked at him. Mrs. Stewart wants this handled with dignity. Scott nodded. She deserves that. He returned the signed papers. I won't contest anything. Darian thanked him. The meeting ended without raised voices, without threats, without bitterness. Scott left, knowing the marriage had reached its legal end long after it had ended emotionally. Meanwhile, Tonia focused on work. She expanded Stewart Restoration Group into another county, exactly as she had planned before discovering Scott's betrayal. Her employees noticed she never allowed personal pain to interfere with her responsibilities. She still arrived before everyone else. She still inspected every project herself. She still treated every homeowner with the same respect. Isaiah Stewart visited one afternoon. He watched her reviewing construction plans. "You haven't slowed down." Tonia smiled. "My work still matters." "It always has." Isaiah looked at her carefully. "How are you really doing?" She answered honestly. "Some days are harder than others. But I won't let one person's choices decide the rest of my life." Isaiah smiled proudly. "That's the strongest answer you could give." At home, the atmosphere became quieter. Jude understood his parents would soon live in separate homes. Tonia never criticized Scott in front of him. Instead, she encouraged Jude to express every question he carried. One evening, Jude asked, "Are you angry with Dad?" Tonia answered gently, "I'm disappointed. There's a difference." Jude listened carefully. "I still love him." "You don't have to stop loving your father. You can love someone and still recognize when they made serious mistakes." Jude nodded. Those words stayed with him. Across town, Scott packed boxes inside a small rental house. The large family home no longer belonged to him under the terms of the agreement. Each empty room reminded him of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary evenings he had once taken for granted. He stopped in Jude's old bedroom. The walls were bare. The shelves were empty. Scott realized he had spent months chasing another future while slowly walking away from the one he already had. He closed the door quietly. There was no one left to blame. Not Tonia, not Maris, not his father, not the agreement. Only himself. A few days later, the divorce became official. Neither Scott nor Tonia celebrated. Both accepted the judge's decision respectfully. As they left the courthouse, Scott looked toward Tonia. "Thank you for handling everything peacefully." She nodded. "I wanted peace for Jude." Scott understood. Even after everything he had done, Tonia had still placed their son first. That truth stayed with him long after they walked in different directions. For the first time in many months, Scott stopped making excuses. He accepted every consequence. He understood that honesty would have cost him much less than deception. The lesson came too late to save his marriage, but it became the first honest step toward changing the man he had allowed himself to become. Several months passed after the divorce. Life slowly settled into new routines. Tonia remained in the family home with Jude. Scott adjusted to living alone. Maris prepared for the arrival of her daughter. Each of them carried different pain. Each of them had to rebuild differently. Every weekday, Tonia continued leading Stewart Restoration Group. The business continued growing because homeowners trusted her work. She hired additional employees and accepted projects across more North Carolina communities. Her personal life had changed. Her commitment to her work had not. One afternoon, Isaiah Stewart walked through another completed restoration project. He smiled as he looked around. "You finished another one." Tonia nodded. "The owners move in next week." Isaiah looked at her. "You've kept moving forward." "I had to." "You've helped a lot of families. I know what it feels like when people think something is beyond saving." Isaiah smiled. "You never stopped believing things could be repaired." Tonia answered honestly, "Not everything. Some things have to end before something healthier can begin." Isaiah nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. At home, Jude adjusted to the new schedule. Some weekends he stayed with Scott. The first visits felt uncomfortable. Neither knew how to begin. One Saturday afternoon, Scott invited Jude to help build a wooden workbench for the garage. Jude picked up a measuring tape. "What do you want me to do?" Scott handed him a pencil. "Mark this board." They worked quietly. Scott showed him how to measure twice before making every cut. After attaching the final piece, Jude stepped back. "It looks good." Scott smiled. "It does." Jude looked at his father. "You taught me something today." Scott nodded. "I should have taught you something much earlier." Jude waited. Scott looked directly at him. "When you make a mistake, admit it immediately. Waiting only makes the damage bigger." Jude remembered the words. "So that's what happened?" Scott answered honestly. "Yes." "For a long time, I kept choosing the easy answer. It became the hardest mistake of my life. Jude nodded slowly. He appreciated that his father finally spoke without making excuses. Their relationship did not return to normal overnight. It improved one honest conversation at a time. Across town, Maris welcomed her daughter into the world. Scott was present for the birth. He held his newborn daughter with gratitude and regret. He promised himself she would never grow up believing lies were acceptable. Maris watched quietly. After returning home, she focused completely on raising her daughter. Scott visited regularly and accepted every responsibility as a father. One afternoon, Maris looked at him. "I've thought a lot about everything." Scott listened. "I blamed myself for months." "You shouldn't have." "I know that now." She looked toward her sleeping daughter. "I believed someone I trusted." Scott lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." Maris nodded. "I've accepted your apology. But accepting it doesn't erase what happened." "It doesn't. We have one responsibility now. Our daughter." Scott agreed immediately. "She deserves honesty from both of us." From that day forward, every conversation between them centered on their child. Nothing more, nothing less. Meanwhile, Tonea watched Jude become more confident. He worked hard in school. He continued designing houses. He even began volunteering on weekends with Tonea's restoration team. One afternoon, he stood inside an old home, waiting to be repaired. He smiled. "This place reminds me of us." Tonea looked at him. "What do you mean?" "It has damage, but it's still standing." She smiled proudly. "I think you've learned something important." "I learned it from watching you." She hugged him. "I'll always be proud of you." Months later, Scott attended one of Jude's school award ceremonies. Tonea was already there. Scott walked over. "Can I sit here?" Tonea nodded. "Of course." They watched Jude receive an award for academic excellence. When the ceremony ended, Jude walked toward both parents with a smile. "I'm glad both of you came." "So are we," Tonea replied. Scott nodded. "We wouldn't miss it." For the first time since the divorce, they stood together without anger, not as husband and wife, as two parents committed to supporting their son. The wounds had not completely disappeared. Some never would. But honesty had finally replaced deception. That change allowed each of them to begin building healthier lives instead of remaining trapped by the choices that had nearly destroyed all of them. 1 year passed. Life no longer revolved around the baby shower. It revolved around the choices each person made after that day. Tonea continued leading Stewart Restoration Group with the same dedication that had earned her respect for years. The company expanded again. More families trusted her to restore homes that others believed could not be saved. One afternoon, while meeting with several homeowners, Tonea noticed something. Many couples argued about money. Others avoided difficult conversations. Some admitted they had never discussed major financial decisions before buying property together. As she listened, she recognized a familiar pattern. Most serious problems did not begin with one terrible decision. They began with small, dishonest conversations that were ignored until they became impossible to hide. That realization inspired her. She met with Isaiah Stewart. "I've been thinking about something." Isaiah smiled. "I can tell. I want Stewart Restoration Group to do more than repair houses." Isaiah listened. "I want families to have a place where they can learn how honest conversations protect relationships before problems grow." Isaiah nodded. "That sounds exactly like something you would build." Within a few months, Tonea partnered with local churches and neighborhood organizations. Once every month, families gathered inside a restored community building. The meetings were simple. No one was judged. People discussed communication, financial planning, marriage, parenting, trust. They learned how to face difficult conversations early instead of waiting until they became painful. Tonea never centered the meetings around herself. She rarely spoke about her own marriage. Instead, she reminded everyone of one lesson. Honesty is always easier at the beginning than at the end. Those words stayed with many families. Several couples later thanked her. One husband admitted, "My wife and I finally talked about our debts." Another couple said, We stopped hiding financial problems from each other. A young father shared. I started telling the truth instead of pretending everything was fine. Tonea smiled each time she heard those stories. Helping families become stronger gave meaning to one of the hardest seasons of her life. Meanwhile, Scott continued rebuilding himself. The internal review at his company ended with a disciplinary decision. He lost his management position. He accepted a smaller role with fewer responsibilities. Some people believed he should leave. Scott stayed. He arrived early every morning. He completed every assignment carefully. He stopped trying to rebuild his reputation with words. He rebuilt it through consistent actions. Months passed. Co-workers noticed the change. Scott no longer searched for recognition. He simply did his work. Outside the office, he remained active in both of his children's lives. Every week, he spent time with Jude. He also cared for his daughter with Maris. He never missed scheduled visits. He never made promises he could not keep. One Saturday, Scott and Jude worked together at a community restoration project organized by Toane's company. Neither of them expected the assignment. They simply volunteered. Side by side, they painted walls and repaired old wooden fences. As they cleaned their tools, Jude looked at his father. "You've changed." Scott smiled slightly. "I'm trying." Jude nodded. "I can see that." Scott looked at his son. "I know I can't erase the past." "You can't, but I can make better choices." Jude smiled. "You already are." Those words meant more to Scott than any promotion he had ever received. Across town, Maris settled into motherhood. Her daughter filled the house with laughter. Life became busy with bottles, bedtime stories, doctor appointments, and first steps. Scott remained present as a father. Maris respected that. Their conversation stayed focused on raising their daughter well. The past no longer controlled every discussion. It became a lesson instead of a daily argument. One afternoon, Maris attended one of Tonea's community meetings. After everyone else left, she walked over. "I've wanted to thank you." Tonea smiled. "You don't have to." "I do." Maris looked around the restored building. "What you're doing here is helping people avoid what happened to all of us." Tonea nodded. "That's the goal." Maris smiled. "I hope a lot of families listen." "So do I." They shook hands. There was no bitterness between them. Only two women who understood how deeply dishonesty could affect innocent people. Years later, Jude graduated from high school. Family members gathered to celebrate. Tonea sat beside Isaiah. Scott sat nearby. Maris attended with her daughter to support Jude. When Jude accepted his diploma, he looked toward every person who had helped shape his life. Later that evening, he thanked his parents. "I learned something important from both of you." Scott listened quietly. Jude continued. "Mom taught me that strength comes from telling the truth, even when it hurts." He turned toward Scott. "And Dad taught me what happens when honesty is delayed." Scott nodded. "That's true." Jude smiled. "I'll remember both lessons for the rest of my life." Scott placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "So will I." As the celebration ended, Tonea looked around at the people standing together. Life had not returned to the way it once was. It had become something different, something wiser. Some relationships had ended, others had slowly healed, but every person now understood one truth. Trust is not built through grand promises. It is built through honest choices made every single day. And once trust is broken, rebuilding it takes far longer than breaking it ever did. That became the lesson their families carried forward, proving that one dishonest choice can change many lives, but one honest decision at a time can still build a stronger future. Chuang ti di duan. Chuang ti di duan, chuang ti di duan, chuang ti di duan. Chuang ti di don, chuang ti di don.
Thank you for staying with Real Unwise Stories. Until next time, stay safe, my amazing family.